It started with a receipt. Not for roses or champagne or whatever romance looks like these days, but for 437 pounds of playground mulch. Yeah, mulch. That itchy, splintery stuff you throw under swing sets to soften the fall when your kid launches themselves off a slide like a little evil Knievel. Except Christine and I don't have kids. Never did. Never planned to. Couldn't even keep a houseplant alive together, let alone raise a human being. So when I opened our joint credit card statement and saw a $182 charge from Barkey's Play Yard Supplies in the middle of February, a month so cold the squirrels had quit, it stuck out like a marching band in a library. Now, Christine had a habit of making spontaneous purchases. She once bought a telescope we never used and a box of dehydrated astronaut meals because, as she put it, you never know when gravity might give up. So at first, I figured maybe she had taken up gardening in the off-season. People get weird in February. Seasonal depression meets post-holiday denial, and suddenly you're spending your tax return on 50 succulents and a compost tumbler. But then there was the second charge, same day, Tiny Tykes Contractors, $1,280. Christine, for the record, is allergic to dirt, children, and the sound of laughter that comes in groups. A woman who once called a neighbor's birthday party an aggressive display of unregulated enthusiasm is not someone who dabbles in playgrounds. So I asked, casually, as casual as a man can be when holding a spreadsheet like it's a subpoena. She was in the kitchen, doing that thing where she opens a cabinet, stares inside like she's hoping it'll suddenly contain all the answers to her life, and then closes it again. I was leaning against the counter pretending to read an article titled 6 Ways to Tell If Your Partner is Lying on my phone, which was just a screenshot of the title, because I never made it past step 1. Christine, I said, what's with the mulch? She blinked at me. Excuse me. Barkey's Play Yard Supplies. You bought a small forest. For children. That we don't have. She squinted. Oh, she said, drawing the word out like it owed her money. That was for a donation. A donation? I repeated. Yes. There's a charity. It's very under the radar. They build tiny parks for underprivileged squirrels. I thought you supported local causes. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes sarcasm is all that keeps a man from setting fire to his own eyebrows. Right. Because nothing says community support like secret squirrel playgrounds. She didn't even flinch. Just shrugged and walked off, muttering something about me not appreciating whimsy. That was Christine in a nutshell. Always 2 steps ahead and 3 steps sideways. You think you're arguing about mulch, and suddenly she's diagnosing you with an inability to dream. No, I didn't go digging through her stuff. That's not my style. I may have spent 23 minutes standing in front of our closet trying to figure out if any of her shoes were missing, but that's more observational than invasive, right? I mean, there's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. Then came the pamphlet. Folded 3 times, crumpled on the passenger side of her car. Camp Horizon. Building a brighter tomorrow for families of the recently reunited. Reunited from what? Intergalactic exile? Cold storage? It had smiley families, a lot of trees, and what looked suspiciously like a brand new jungle gym in the background. I held on to that pamphlet like it was a lost chapter from our marriage, trying to decode its secrets. I even Googled the camp. Turns out it's a retreat for parents re-entering their children's lives after complex life events. Again, we have no children. Unless Christine had been parenting in shifts like a substitute teacher, something wasn't adding up. The final piece clicked into place when I saw Christine at the hardware store on a Tuesday at 3:12 p.m. She was supposed to be at work, somewhere in the depths of a nonprofit doing consulting, which, based on her descriptions, involved a lot of circular meetings and very little actual labor. But there she was, in the garden section, laughing. Not just laughing, but doing the sort of full-body lean-in you reserve for people who know your middle name and how you take your coffee. And he was there. A man with a ponytail and a graphic tee that said, Mulch Matters. He looked like a guy who wrote poetry in tool sheds. He handed her a bag of pea gravel like it was a love letter. She touched his arm and laughed again. I could practically hear the wedding bells made of compost. I didn't confront her. I didn't march in with the pamphlet in one hand and a rake in the other. No, I waited. I waited for her to come home that evening, drop her purse by the door, and ask what we were having for dinner like we hadn't been quietly drifting into different dimensions for months. I waited until she sat down and kicked off her boots and told me about traffic like it was the day's greatest villain. Then I said, Did you ever think about telling me you had a second life as a playground philanthropist? She paused, blinked. Excuse me. I held up the pamphlet. Camp Horizon. Mulch. Contractors. Unless we've both been sleepwalking into a parenthood we didn't sign up for, you're either secretly a humanitarian, or you're dating someone who owns a shovel. She didn't answer right away, just stared at the floor like it was whispering legal advice. Then she said the words I'll never forget. Benjamin, it's more complicated than that. Which is code for you're right, but I need time to make myself the hero of this story. I didn't get mad, didn't yell. I just nodded, because by then, the hurt had already calcified into something else, something quieter. So no, she didn't sit me down and cry and confess. She let the mulch do the talking. And somehow, that was worse. Christine had a gift. Not a talent, a gift. Like one of those novelty mugs that looks like it might hold meaning, but turns out to be just ceramic with a bad joke on the side. Her gift was the ability to explain things in a way that made you question your own grip on reality. Once, she convinced me we needed a third blender because the kitchen deserved symmetry. We don't even drink smoothies. That's the level of confidence she operated on. So when the city inspector showed up at our front door on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and a deeply apologetic look on his face, I wasn't shocked. I was just impressed she'd somehow managed to get herself involved in something that required official documentation and a man in khaki pants who clearly hated confrontation. Sir, he said, tugging at his municipal ID lanyard like it might magically transport him away, I'm here about the structure in your backyard. I stared at him. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even confused. I just hadn't had coffee yet and was emotionally unprepared for the word structure being said before 9 a.m. You mean the shed? I asked, glancing out toward the fence. I had built that thing myself 2 summers ago. It wasn't pretty, but it stood up against the wind and didn't leak unless it rained horizontally. No, not the shed, he said. The facility. Facility. He sighed like this wasn't his first facility of the day. There's been a report of an unpermitted community structure being erected on the property, possibly zoned for child use. I blinked. Are you saying someone thinks we're running a preschool? He didn't answer. Just turned his clipboard around and pointed to a photo. In the picture, our backyard, where I had last seen patchy grass and a broken rake, now featured what could only be described as a playground. But not the cheap kind with rust and hollow metal tubes that scream when you touch them. This had color-coded monkey bars, 3 different slide styles, and a forward climbing wall that looked suspiciously like reclaimed barnwood. That wasn't the most interesting part, though. The most interesting part was the banner, hanging right above the fake treehouse roof. Horizon plays Saturdays, private session, Christine's group only. Oh, I said, because there wasn't much else to say. Right. The inspector smiled in a way that said, it's not my circus, but I do have to fill out the paperwork. He handed me a warning notice, told me to follow up with the zoning office, and walked away like he was trying to exit a dream. That night, Christine came home from wherever she came home from. Her calendar was full of events that always sounded like yoga but smelled suspiciously like evasion, and set her purse down like it hadn't just organized a summer camp without a license. Christine, I said, holding the notice, did you open a childcare franchise in our backyard? She looked at the paper like it was written in Swahili. Oh, that, she said. It's not official. Not official, I echoed, reading the words, unauthorized structure, section 94.12b violation out loud. I mean, I'm not charging them. So they just show up? Well, there's an interest form. You made a form? She blinked. Do you want me to delete the spreadsheet? And that was Christine in a nutshell. She didn't deny the crime. She just offered to archive the evidence. That night, I did something radical. I logged into our shared cloud storage. Not because I was suspicious. Suspicion implies a desire to catch someone. I just wanted to understand what kind of Google form required parents to indicate their child's bounce-back ability after minor disappointment. There it was. A full system. RSVP list, parent waivers, snack allergy tabs, and a budgeting sheet titled, "Bin doesn't need to see this." Christine had monetized our backyard without taking a single dollar. She was running a barter-based recreational empire, and I hadn't even been offered an honorary badge or laminated ID. And I was still stuck on the fact that mulch had been the tip of the pyramid scheme. Then came the email. Not to me, of course not, but to our shared email account, where Christine had evidently forgotten to log out on the tablet. The subject line read, Donation pickup, Christine's extra supplies. The message was from a guy named Darren. Who's Darren? I'm glad you asked. According to his email signature, Darren was the co-founder of something called Urban Horizon Outreach. Their tagline? Rebuilding broken bridges between families. The email was brief. Something about how Christine's latest donation of enrichment toys had arrived, and how grateful they were for her continued partnership, both personally and emotionally. Now, I'm no Sherlock Holmes, but if someone's thanking your wife for an emotional partnership and also mentioning shared toy distribution logistics, chances are something beyond the slide set is being lubricated. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I called the number in the email. Not to confront Darren. I just wanted to know what kind of organization used a bouncy castle budget to solve childhood trauma. The woman who answered the phone was chipper in that uniquely corporate volunteer coordinator way. Urban Horizon Outreach. How may I direct your call? Yes. Hi, I said. I'm trying to get more information about donations. My wife may have contributed. Oh, she chirped. Is this Benjamin? Now that's a sentence that chills the spine. Yes. Oh, Christine mentioned you. You must be so proud of what she's doing with the program. The way she and Darren work together is truly inspiring. Most people wouldn't be comfortable with that kind of reunion situation. Reunion, I repeated. Oh yes. The story is just amazing. How Christine reconnected with Darren and how they're building something beautiful together, not just for themselves, but for the kids. It's really touched us all. There it was, delivered with the same tone people use to announce an engagement or a gender reveal. Except the reveal was, your wife's been building a youth outreach nonprofit with her ex and never mentioned it because apparently zoning violations are easier to explain than rekindled relationships. I thanked the woman, hung up, and stared at the wall for a while. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was just genuinely curious how I'd managed to be demoted from husband to uninformed homeowner in my own marriage. That weekend, Christine hosted another community gathering. I sat inside and watched through the blinds as Darren arrived in a van that had Outreach Vehicle Number 3 printed on the side like they were running a convoy of goodwill. He handed Christine a clipboard. She laughed at something he said and touched his arm in that overly casual way that means it's not casual at all. I sipped my coffee. Not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed to hold something warm to remind myself I was, in fact, still a living participant in this farce. It wasn't about Darren, or mulch, or even the playground, which I had admittedly underestimated as a prop in a much larger drama. It was about Christine building a life around me that no longer included me, except as the guy who paid the mortgage on her secret community center. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't need to, because the city inspector came back Monday morning, this time with a fine. Christine texted me in all caps. Why didn't you handle it? I texted back. I didn't know I was on staff. The first real confirmation came courtesy of the Parks and Rec Committee. And I don't mean the TV show with the peppy theme music. I'm talking about actual city employees and windbreakers who hold laminated maps like they contain national secrets. You know something in your life has taken a wrong turn when the person ruining your week is a man named Carl with a utility belt and a clipboard that looks older than your mortgage. Carl knocked at the door at 2:45 on a Tuesday, which is an hour no one should be allowed to perform surprise visits unless they're delivering cash or quietly removing student loans from your name. I opened it, wearing the same shirt I'd been wearing for 2 days because honestly, dignity left the building around the time Christine rebranded our backyard. Mr. Green, he asked, peering at me like I might be harboring illegal fireworks or a pet giraffe. Sure, I said, depending on what this is about. He looked down at the clipboard. We've received a complaint about an unauthorized use of public programming under private property codes. Is that a real sentence? I asked. Carl didn't blink. He pointed his pen behind me toward the backyard, where the Horizon banner had now been joined by 2 folding tables labeled Sign In and Reflection Station. There were also beanbags. Dozens of beanbags, which, until that moment, I had assumed were a kind of performance art protest against seating with structure. We've been informed, Carl continued, that your property is being used as the unofficial venue for what appears to be a civic youth enrichment series. Unofficial venue, I repeated. That's flattering. He raised an eyebrow. Are you denying knowledge of this event? No, I'm just enjoying the way you phrased it. Enrichment series makes it sound like TED Talks for people under 4 feet tall. Carl sighed and wrote something on his form that I can only assume was a bureaucratic version of "Don't try to be cute." Christine, naturally, was not home. She was in a session, which, according to her calendar, could mean anything from conflict mediation to papier-mâché with purpose. She'd recently started using the phrase intentional collaboration, which I think was code for, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I've printed things in color. I offered Carl a tour of the backyard, which he declined, citing liability. He handed me another warning, our second that month, and left without stepping past the welcome mat. That evening, I taped the new violation to the fridge next to the first one, creating what I now refer to as our wall of public acknowledgement. Christine walked right past it and poured herself a glass of cucumber water like she hadn't just dragged our home into the realm of municipal legend. We need to talk, I said, which is universally known as the least fun sentence in English. She didn't flinch. About what? About how we're apparently co-hosting a youth development series without a business license or marital consensus. Christine waved a hand. Benjamin, it's not a business. It's a movement. Well, I said, tapping the fridge, the movement now has a code enforcement number and its own paper trail. She glanced at the notice and smiled like I'd presented her with a mildly disappointing Yelp review. Carl's just doing his job. We all have roles. You gave a child a laminated name tag with the title Junior Visionary. He asked for one. He's 7. He's advanced. I stared at her. Christine had reached a level of self-justification that could only be described as Olympic. If self-deception were a sport, she'd have sponsorship deals and a cereal box by now. Later that week, something even more educational arrived in the mail, a postcard. Handwritten. In cursive. Addressed to Christine. From someone named Esther, board chair, Horizon Grader. The front featured a photo of smiling people planting tiny trees. On the back, Esther gushed about Christine's visionary leadership and expressed gratitude for her courageous reconciliation with Darren. There it was again. That name. Darren. The mulchy mystery man who always appeared right before the popsicle sticks and inspirational chalk quotes. Reconciliation. I Googled the phrase, Horizon Grader, expecting to find a real nonprofit. What I got was a website that looked like it was designed by someone who once read a blog post about websites. Every sentence was riddled with terms like emotional bandwidth and transformative proximity. There was no mention of last names, but under the Our Stories tab, there was a smiling photo of Christine with a caption that read, Christine, field partner, reunification ally. There's a certain kind of silence that happens when you realize your spouse has rebranded herself without telling you. It's not dramatic. There's no music or montage. It's just a soft, dull click somewhere in your chest, like a door quietly locking from the inside. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed something. Not proof. Just something real. Something undeniable. The opportunity came on the day of the Horizon Talent Harvest, which was apparently a performance showcase and networking opportunity for youth leaders and their emotionally re-engaged caregivers. Which, for those of us still pretending we weren't neck-deep in nonsense, translated to Christine's Backyard Festival of Controlled Chaos. There were hand-painted signs, gluten-free everything, and a performance schedule printed on seed paper. Kids played drums made out of recycled shipping tubes. Parents clapped like they understood what was happening. Christine wore a linen tunic and referred to me as the logistical anchor of the space. Around noon, I was helping one of the visionaries plug in a karaoke machine when I heard it. Darren. Talking to someone just behind the lemonade stand. He was explaining how rebuilding a family requires flexible definitions. Now, I don't know much about flexible definitions, but I'm fairly certain I didn't agree to loan my lawn to someone's emotional reunion tour. Christine walked over, flanked by Darren and a woman named Misty who I think was either a breathwork instructor or just got lost on her way to a drum circle. Benjamin, she said, this is Misty. She's facilitating our forgiveness thread. That's great, I said. Have either of you filed for a conditional land use permit? Misty blinked. That's not really the energy we're cultivating. No, I said, but it's the one the city is. Christine frowned. Darren smiled the way people do when they think they've already won the argument you haven't started yet. That evening, when the last folding chair was returned and the beanbags were deflated and stacked like resigned pancakes, I asked Christine directly, Are you in a relationship with Darren? She didn't answer at first. Just looked at me like I'd asked if the son was considering retirement. I'm in a co-repair cycle with Darren, she said finally. That's not a thing, I said. It is in our context. So there it was. Not a confession. Not even an admission. Just Christine, fully convinced she could file her betrayal under a new label and call it progress. The moment it all clicked was when I realized Christine had replaced me with a spreadsheet. Not emotionally. Not romantically. Functionally. I was no longer a partner. I was a row, row 17, to be exact, on the Household Synergy Logistics Tracker, version 4.6. She shared it during what she called our quarterly transparency review, which, unlike most things in our relationship lately, had a calendar invite and a Google Meet link, even though we live in the same house. I opened the document thinking it was going to be a summary of our bills or maybe some color-coded reminders about recycling pickup. I was wrong. Christine had created a 22-tab workbook, each more condescending than the last. There was one for task fulfillment ratios, where she tracked how many times I'd vacuumed in the last 3 months compared to how often she held space emotionally for intergenerational healing. Spoiler, she gave herself a 5-star rating on that one. And for vacuuming, I got a frowny face emoji and the note, "Benjamin still doesn't understand attachments." Then came the real masterpiece, Household Impact Review. External stakeholders. I scrolled down and saw a column labeled Mentorship Presence Quantitative, and another one titled Emotional Legacy Projected. My name had zeros across the board. Darren, who I had never officially invited into my life, had green highlights and a gold star next to narrative ownership. Narrative ownership. At this point, I realized I wasn't in a marriage anymore. I was in a human resources pilot program that hadn't received funding yet. I closed the laptop and said, "Christine, do you hear yourself?" She nodded, completely missing the sarcasm. "Yes. And I've been doing a lot of work around that." I wanted to ask what kind of work, but I was afraid the answer would involve interpretive dance or a podcast with the word vibrations in the title. The next day, I received an email from a man named Tyler. Tyler introduced himself as Horizon's narrative strategy lead, which I can only assume means guy who owns a ring light and charges people to summarize their own trauma. Tyler wanted to confirm my availability for the Restoring Your Role roundtable Christine had apparently signed me up for. It was set to take place in our living room on a Sunday at 9 a.m. I replied with a simple, "I don't recall enrolling in a narrative overhaul." He replied within 6 minutes with a Zoom link and a PDF titled Benjamin's Emergence Pathway, Draft. I skimmed it. It was 10 pages of charts, arrows, and something called a restorative arc, which suggested I would be undergoing a temporary ego shedding before re-entering the relationship as a present-tense masculine ally. I closed the laptop and unplugged the router. Christine walked in 5 minutes later and said, "The Wi-Fi's down." "Must be the universe's way of encouraging silence," I said. She stared at me like I'd just quoted something from her favorite blog. "Exactly," she said. "Stillness is communication." That weekend, I began preparing for a different kind of event. Not one with chalkboards or role-play exercises. A quiet, self-assigned project. Christine had always taken pride in saying I wasn't built for confrontation, and for once, she wasn't entirely wrong. But what I lacked in volume, I made up for in follow-through. So I started sorting. Not her things, mine. My accounts, my documents, my history that had slowly become background noise in a life I didn't recognize anymore. You learn a lot when you dig through your own inbox after 6 years of shared calendars and deferred decisions. That's when I found it. The email. Sent to me by mistake. A forward from Darren with the subject, Horizon Impact, final draft before public posting. The message had been meant for Christine but autofilled with my name instead. Maybe a divine glitch, or maybe Google just couldn't keep up with who Christine was collaborating with this week. Inside the email was a link to Horizon's upcoming digital newsletter. Christine had written a feature piece titled Rediscovery Through Relational Realignment. The opening paragraph included this line. "It wasn't until I paused the performance of being a wife that I could truly re-enter the world as a participant in my own story." I read that line 3 times. Each time it got dumber. Further down, she described the moment she and Darren acknowledged their bond through the lens of shared generational undoing. I don't know what that means. I don't think anyone does. It sounds like a Hallmark card ghostwritten by a philosophy major with too much free time. At the bottom of the page, in small italicized print, "Special thanks to Benjamin, who unknowingly held space for this process to unfold." Unknowingly held space. Translation: stood there like a lamp while I conducted emotional group therapy on his lawn. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it. I just printed it out and taped it next to the violation notices on the fridge. When Christine saw it the next morning, she stared at it for a long time, then said, "I was going to show you that." "Why didn't you?" I asked. She shrugged. "I didn't think you'd understand the context." It took everything in me not to laugh. "Christine, you're thanking me for something I didn't know I was doing while describing a relationship you didn't tell me you were having." It's not about labels, she said. It's also apparently not about consent. That night, I moved the printer into the guest room. She asked why. I said I was reclaiming space for my own emergence pathway. She didn't appreciate the tone. The next few days were quiet. She stopped using phrases like emotional architecture around me. I think she suspected I might start labeling things in return, like marital delusion and strategic narcissism. Then came the neighborhood forum post. I hadn't expected to be part of one of those Facebook community drama threads, but here we were. Christine had posted a thank you to the many local families who've embraced our journey with Horizon and included a photo of the backyard with Darren in the background, holding a whiteboard. The caption, "When your personal life becomes your greatest contribution to the world." I got 3 text messages within an hour. One from our neighbor Jeff asking if we were starting a cult, one from my coworker Ed simply saying, and one from my mother, who does not use emojis, sending me 5 thumbs downs in a row. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I logged into the neighborhood forum and created my first post in 6 years. It read, "Hi, Benjamin here. Yes, Christine and Darren are running a community project out of our backyard. No, I'm not part of it. Yes, they have a newsletter. No, I don't subscribe. If you hear interpretive drumming at 8 a.m., I recommend headphones or a long walk. If you see children painting cardboard boxes labeled emotion pods, please know that I have no idea what those are and did not sign the insurance waiver. Thank you for your patience during this strange season of collaborative noise." Within 20 minutes, my post had more likes than her original one. Within an hour, Christine deleted hers. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed and said, "You're mocking something that means a lot to me." I didn't mock it, I said. I just translated it. Christine once described our neighborhood as energetically stagnant, which I assumed was her polite way of saying the McMillans 2 doors down have a yard full of decorative frogs and the Lamberts haven't updated their shutters since the Bush administration. I like the stagnancy. It meant no one knocked on your door unless you'd left your garage open or committed the unthinkable crime of putting your recycling bin on the wrong side of the driveway. Then the Homeowners Association entered our lives like a soap opera villain you forgot existed, but who suddenly returns from an unexplained cruise with a personal vendetta. It began with an envelope. Most HOA letters are plain white and passive-aggressive. This one was glossy. There was a blue and gold embossed seal and everything. Looked like it was designed by someone who wanted to be a diplomat but settled for enforcing fence height limits in the suburbs. The letter opened with "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Green," which was already inaccurate. Christine hadn't used Mrs. since the time she declared marital titles were a colonial naming construct. It continued with several paragraphs that managed to say nothing and everything at once. The summary: we were in violation of sections 3, 4, 8, and somehow 14b of the HOA Charter. I read it out loud in the kitchen while Christine watered a plant she bought but never named, which apparently now symbolized growth without permission. Excessive foot traffic, non-residential programming, unauthorized semi-permanent structures. I paused. Semi-permanent. Christine didn't look up. It's modular. Does that mean I can disassemble it with a wrench? Or is it just expensive plywood that emotionally validates itself? I think you're being reactive, she said. They think we're running an unlicensed event space, I replied. The McMillans have frogs, Christine. We have zoning concerns. She walked out of the room mid-sentence, leaving me with a printed letter, a dying plant, and a sudden memory of how peaceful life used to be when the biggest issue in our marriage was her refusal to admit that aloe vera isn't a decorative item. Then came the workshop. Horizon's first community expansion session, allegedly designed to bring awareness to neighborhood tension through authentic facilitated expression. The invite went out via email and was hand-delivered to every house on our street. I only found out when Jeff rang my doorbell holding the flyer like it had been laced with biohazard dust. "Ben," he said, "what the heck is this?" I read the flyer. On the front, a photo of Christine and Darren standing in front of our now infamous climbing wall. Darren was wearing a t-shirt that read, "Let's talk about your timeline." Christine was holding what I assume was a hand drum. The caption read, "Reclaim your narrative, rebuild the neighborhood." Inside was a schedule, which included breakout circles called Fence Talk and something listed as lawn intention mapping. There was also a silent feedback mural, which I assume was a whiteboard where people were encouraged to draw their unspoken grievances like interpretive therapy for people who feared confrontation but loved markers. "Are you doing this?" Jeff asked. "No," I said. "Can I come anyway?" "If you bring a lawn chair and low expectations." Christine, of course, was thrilled. She wore her best woven wrap and referred to the lawn as a communal canvas. I noticed she had labeled the patio chairs by vibe. One was reflection, one was courage, and one was Benjamin, if participating. I chose the driveway. About 12 people showed up, which was 12 more than I expected. Most were curious. A few were suspicious. One woman named Barb was there solely because she misread the flyer and thought there would be cider. Darren opened the session by asking us to center our shared discomfort, which I found ironic coming from a man who parked his hybrid on my grass. Christine followed by talking about relational flexibility and how community starts in the body, not the bylaws. Then came the activity, drawing your emotional topography using sidewalk chalk. Jeff drew a large circle and labeled it, "My garage," then sat down and didn't speak for the rest of the event. Someone asked if this counted as a sanctioned HOA meeting. Christine said, "This isn't a meeting, it's an emergence." That sentence, I believe, will haunt me longer than our wedding vows. I stayed just long enough to witness Darren suggest we form a narrative neighbor council and propose monthly yard check-ins. That's when I walked inside and turned off the porch light, a symbolic gesture that no one noticed because someone had strung up battery-powered fairy lights shaped like tiny suns. The next day, the HOA issued a formal notice of hearing. Christine referred to it as pushback from outdated systems. I called it consequences. 3 nights later, I came home to find the dining table covered in index cards. Christine had made a conflict clarification deck. It featured prompts like, what would your 8-year-old self say to your current approach to personal space? And how do you define fairness without using numbers? I suggested a new card. Why is your marriage now a community theater project? She didn't laugh. That weekend, Darren stopped by unannounced to drop off materials. The materials turned out to be 4 folding chairs, 2 floor cushions, and a stack of zines titled Collaborative Futures for Nonlinear Households. He asked if I wanted to talk. I asked if he owned a calendar. He said, time isn't always structured. I said, my mailbox is. He blinked like I'd quoted something profound, then left me holding a tote bag with the Horizon logo and what looked like a granola bar made out of reclaimed oats. That night, Christine sat across from me and asked, are you ever going to engage with what this is becoming? You mean our marriage or your startup? She shook her head. You're missing the evolution. No, I said. I'm just not clapping while it happens. Christine's final contribution to our relationship was an Excel formula that miscalculated her own credibility. It was embedded in a tab titled Relationship Recalibration, Phase 2, which she emailed me after our last HOA summons. Apparently, she felt a summary of our relational returns on emotional investment would be a productive next step. The document arrived with no greeting, just the subject line, Progress Snapshot, for your integration. The spreadsheet had conditional formatting that turned cells green if alignment was achieved and red if disengagement metrics exceeded 70%. I'm not making this up. I wish I were. The row labeled Benjamin had been evaluated across 6 categories: empathy engagement, boundary softness, narrative participation, adaptive affection, community amplification, and time presence. You will not be shocked to hear I failed 5 of them. The only one where I received a passing grade was time presence, and that had an asterisk next to it that said, mostly physical. I scrolled down to see how Darren was doing. No red cells. Just a lot of bright greens and a column note that read, exemplifies emergent masculinity with emotional courage. I replied, Christine, please remove me from all future assessments. Benjamin, that seemed like a good place to end things, but Christine, as ever, had other plans. The HOA hearing was held in the community center gym, a place previously used only for Zumba classes and chili cook-offs with questionable judging. That night, however, it was transformed into a forum for neighborhood accountability. Folding chairs were set up in rows, and a microphone on a wobbly stand sat in the center, like we were about to choose a prom king instead of determine whether my marriage counted as a code violation. Christine showed up in an outfit that can only be described as aspirationally neutral. Darren was already there, speaking with Barb, who I learned had taken over the unofficial newsletter and recently started including Horizon blurbs under a section titled All Community Updates. I sat near the back, between Jeff and a woman named Denise who brought popcorn like it was a performance. I couldn't disagree. The board called the meeting to order. Agenda Item 4. Use of private property for public programming. Christine stood to speak. She thanked the community for their receptive patience and explained how Horizon had facilitated unanticipated unity through non-transactional engagement. A board member named Steve, who once fined me for leaving my Christmas lights up until January 5th, asked, "Are you running a business?" Christine said, "We're running a shared narrative environment." Steve blinked. "Do people pay to be in the narrative?" "No," she said. "They contribute energy and intentionality." "Is that taxable?" he asked. Christine frowned. "What are we really taxing, money or meaning?" That's when Denise choked slightly on her popcorn, and someone 2 rows ahead of me actually wrote that quote down. Then it was my turn. I approached the microphone, cleared my throat, and said, "I'd like to opt out of the narrative." The room went quiet. "I didn't sign up for Horizon," I said. "I didn't vote on community outreach. I didn't apply for a second marriage with footnotes, and I definitely didn't agree to be a case study in emotional logistics." Christine stood up. "This isn't about you, Benjamin. That's been clear for a while," I said. "But my lawn, my electricity, my name on the property title, that part still involves me." Darren interjected from his seat. "We see your frustration, Benjamin. We really do." "Do you?" I asked. "Because I've been listening to people explain my own marriage to me for 3 months. I've read my name in grant proposals. I've been thanked in newsletters I didn't subscribe to. I've seen my relationship turned into a shared Google document." Christine looked tired for the first time. "This project was never meant to hurt you," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "It was meant to ignore me." And that was it. The board voted. The programming was to be suspended pending a full review. Christine was told to remove all signage and disassemble anything taller than 4 feet. Darren tried to make a closing statement and was politely advised to submit it in writing. The next day, I came home from work to find Christine packing up the Horizon materials. The beanbags were gone. The laminated name tags were stacked in a box marked Archive. She didn't say anything until I reached the top of the stairs. "I'll be staying with a friend for a while," she said. "To process." I nodded. "Is it Darren?" "No," she said. "Someone from the forum." I didn't ask. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just looked at each other like 2 people who had both tried to win a game neither of us understood, using rules we made up too late. After she left, I walked into the backyard. It looked like a patchy mess again. No murals, no cushions, just a square of grass that wasn't thriving and wasn't failing. It just was. I pulled out my phone and opened the shared calendar. Deleted every recurring event titled Reflective Session, Required. Then I made a new one. Tuesday, 7 p.m., whatever I want. No invites sent. It felt great. The next week, I received an email from Christine. Short this time. Just a subject line, closure request form. I didn't open it. Some endings don't need paperwork. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel